Yes, welcome. Was just waiting to see who all trickled in, but we will go ahead and get started with today's program. Thank you everyone for joining us on this very hot July afternoon. So it's a good day to be inside in air conditioning, hopefully, and also enjoying today's program. My name is Candace Summers. I'm the Director of Education for the McLean County Museum of History, and I'm thrilled to welcome all of you to today's webinar. We could not have programs like today's without support from the community, our members, and people like you. If you enjoy today's program, consider becoming a member if you're not already one, or making a donation by following the link I'm going to put in today's chat box to continue supporting programs like you're going to see today. And I also want to thank Illinois Humanities for support of this program as well. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to go over the format for today's program. We will be recording today's program so that people who could not join us can watch it later. If you have a question for our speaker, please submit it in the Q&A box at the bottom bar. You just hover your mouse over it and you'll see the Q&A box, and you can type your questions in there. And then I will read those questions off at the end of the program so that our speaker can answer them. If you're having a technical issue, say with sound, please drop a comment in the chat box, also located at the bottom bar, and we'll see if we can resolve that issue. Now I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Sarah Sullivan, instructor and chair of the Department of History at McHenry County College, who will present today's program, The Emancipation Proclamation and Abraham Lincoln's Evolving Views on Slavery. Ms. Sullivan has taught at McHenry College since 1997, specializing in women's history, the American Revolution, and 19th century political and social history. She became fascinated with Abraham Lincoln starting when she was 7 years old after her family vacationed in Springfield, Illinois. And with that, I am pleased to introduce Sarah Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Candace. I am excited to be here. A couple ground rules just to get us started. Number one, I'm hoping all of you are enjoying the air conditioning. Mine is not working. I'm having quite a run of washing machine and air conditioning and all sorts of things. So you may notice it's very hot in my house. We'll see how that goes. Also, it is challenging to be a participant or a presenter in this format because it's difficult to get a sense of interest or lack thereof with the audience. So I'm going to do my absolute best. I'm very grateful for the fact that we have Zoom available to us. Zoom was not a verb and a noun in the way it is now 6 months ago. So we are grateful to have Zoom available and to be able to do this presentation using Zoom. The last housekeeping issue is about Abraham Lincoln himself. For those of you who are Abraham Lincoln scholars and aficionados, you probably already know he's a tough nut to crack. Abraham Lincoln very rarely talked about himself or his personal views on anything. So it's hard to know what it is that he thinks. He is the subject of, I can't even count how many books. Everyone who's anyone has written a book about Abraham Lincoln. And they all take slightly different tacks in how they approach his record and his story. And again, part of that is possible because he is such an enigma. So my thought on how we would tackle the question of the Emancipation Proclamation and the issue of slavery is to look at some of the words of Abraham Lincoln himself. So that is the path that I have charted today. And we'll see if there are any questions or any issues at the end, and we'll go from there. So to get us started, hopefully, there we go. What I've done again is I've listed out a variety of speeches and letters, correspondence by Abraham Lincoln that address the issue of slavery. This is not a comprehensive list. Abraham Lincoln was known to give many, many speeches, but I tried to come up with a variety through the history of his adult life in order to help us see how his perspective changed. Now this brings up one other interesting point. How much of this evolution is Abraham Lincoln's views changing and how much of it is the idea that society as a whole was able to change, and Abraham Lincoln was able to push things a little bit further. Had he started with emancipation in 1837, when his first known remarks on the record appeared, he would not have been successful. So he was very good at sensing the temperature of the nation, and very good at just having incremental change. So with that in mind, the first record of Abraham Lincoln speaking about or addressing the issue of slavery came March 3rd of 1837. Abraham Lincoln was 28, and he and Dan Stone were both in the Illinois General Assembly, and they decided to speak out against the issue of slavery. So they brought a resolution forward regarding that topic. What I've done with all of these quotes by Abraham Lincoln that you'll see in these slides is I've bolded the words that are Abraham Lincoln's in order to help them pop out. I'm assuming everyone's a pretty good reader, so I won't necessarily read all of them to you. But in this particular set of comments, Dan Stone and Abraham Lincoln were expressing the idea that they didn't like slavery, but still reinforcing the idea that the Constitution prevented the elimination of slavery in the states, although they felt as though slavery could be eliminated in Washington, D.C. if people chose that approach. So again, pretty early on, Abraham Lincoln is starting to advocate for some changes in slavery. January 27th, 1838. In this particular speech, he really doesn't tackle the issue of slavery directly. He spends most of his comments that relate at all to slavery talking about Elijah Lovejoy. As many of you may know, Elijah Lovejoy was an abolitionist and a publisher who lived in St. Louis. He moved to Alton, Illinois, which is not too far from St. Louis. And he moved to Alton because he was having a challenging time living in St. Louis as an abolitionist. He discovered that just over the river, things were not that much different. On the day he showed up, his printing press was thrown into the river. Soon after, he was killed by an angry mob. Abraham Lincoln focuses his comments on this day on the general lawlessness and his concerns about slavery and mob violence as they connect to the issue of slavery. So we see that again, he's encouraging people to think about current events, and he's trying to cause people to think a little bit about slavery, but he himself is still not in the place where we know him to be on January 1st, 1863, when he signs the Emancipation Proclamation. So moving forward, 1841, he writes in a letter to a friend that he remembers slavery from his time on a riverboat in Kentucky. He talks about how slaves were being transported precisely like so many fish upon a trot line. And he acknowledges that slaves were probably in many cases broken up as families and sent away from loved ones, and talks about the difficulty of slavery because of that. So he's humanizing these African Americans, humanizing slavery, and really trying to put a face on it. So again, this is an interesting time in American history. 1841 is right in that antebellum period when we start to see more and more conflicts arising related to slavery. And these conflicts come up because of expansion into the West. We've got the Mexican-American War about to happen. We've got the War of Texas Independence soon to unfold. We've also had expansion into the Missouri territory, or into the Louisiana territory. So all of this is causing a new set of questions. What do we do about slavery? Initially, it was hoped that slavery would just sort of die off like it did in most other countries, because slavery wasn't necessarily very cost effective. What changed slavery was really the cotton gin. Eli Whitney probably had no idea what he was unleashing, but the cotton gin made slavery so much more economically viable that it encouraged the growth of slavery. Further, cotton really exhausts the soil. So because cotton is such a challenging crop to grow, the only way that people are going to be able to continue to grow cotton is to expand into newer territories as the older ones start to, as they start to see their cotton yields decline. So slavery, therefore, has to move to that new territory as well. Otherwise, those slave owners end up losing the value of their slaves. It's also important to note that slavery existed in all 13 of the colonies and was not extinguished in the North until into the 1820s in New York. So because slavery was a national sort of condition for quite a long time, in the North, slavery was eliminated, not so much because of moral arguments, although there were definitely people who had moral arguments against slavery. In great part, it was eliminated because it wasn't as cost effective. The types of industry and businesses that people in the North were engaged in were very different than those in the South, and slavery didn't make as much sense. You have an enormous amount of immigrants coming in the North, and all of that created a different economic system that didn't require slavery. As slavery was extinguished in the North, slaveholders up there had two options. They could either free their slaves, and people definitely did that. But of course, when you free your slaves, you lose the economic value of that slave. The other option was to sell them down further south where there was more demand for slaves. And in many, many cases, as slavery was eradicated in the North, those individuals were sold down further and further into the South. So it's important to see slavery as a broad national issue. Very early on, everyone again thought slavery would probably die out, but because it wasn't dying out, this issue of slavery became a bigger problem with every state that was added to the Union. And for a long time, the country tried to just maintain a balance with the understanding that because slavery was in the Constitution, that states that had slavery at the time the Constitution was signed had a right to slavery. States that were added later that were added as slave states, they had a right to those slaves. So the issue for many, including Abraham Lincoln, was about expansion of slavery. How do we prevent it from getting any bigger than it is? Hoping again that would just allow it to naturally die out versus having to end slavery in the way that we ended up ending it. So moving on, 1849, Abraham Lincoln prepares a resolution to abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. He prepares this knowing that there's another resolution that's out there, but he wants to have his ready just in case the GOT resolution is not introduced. So here are the terms of the resolution that Abraham Lincoln puts together. He says that any child of a slave born after January 1st, 1850 is an apprentice rather than a slave. And as an apprentice, they would be freed at an unspecified age and considered adult. Now, with this, it's interesting to note that in Illinois, we did not have slavery. However, we did have apprentices. And particularly in the southern part of the state, we had a lot of African Americans who were apprenticed. And this was a way to kind of get around the issue of slavery or having slavery or not having slavery. So the other terms of this resolution that Abraham Lincoln put together says that other slaves would stay slaves unless the owners chose to free them. And if that were to happen, that the federal government would compensate the owners. And finally, it prohibited the removal of slaves from the District of the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., unless under specific conditions. This resolution did not end up being introduced to Congress because the GOT resolution did come up and ended up failing. But again, as early as 1849, we see Abraham Lincoln wrestling with how to eliminate slavery. He was not the only one. Thomas Jefferson is well known for saying that slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. You know, what do you do? How do you let it go? And what happens next? This issue of what happens next is a very complicated issue, and in some ways we're still struggling with it today. So 1852, Abraham Lincoln delivers a eulogy for Henry Clay. Henry Clay was one of Abraham Lincoln's idols. He really appreciated Henry Clay's politics and kind of mirrored himself on Henry Clay. So in Springfield, a week after Clay's death, Abraham Lincoln made this eulogy, and he talked about emancipation and colonization as a solution to the issue of slavery. Colonization was a very popular idea. There were many politicians who felt that colonization was the solution. And Abraham Lincoln was actually an officer of the Illinois Colonization Society. He spoke several times, at least twice that we know of, and possibly even more than that, to that particular organization on the idea of colonization. And Abraham Lincoln was still promoting this idea of colonization into 1862. So this was something that he felt made sense all the way through all the way through until the Emancipation Proclamation was delivered. Again, this is not Abraham Lincoln as an outlier. This is Abraham Lincoln as a politician who's consistent with many politicians who saw that, who wanted to see the abolition of slavery. Because again, we eliminate slavery, and then what happens? What comes next? 1854, we see a fragment on slavery. So Abraham Lincoln was known for using his stovetop hat as a bit of a filing cabinet, and he would scribble notes on pieces of paper and tuck them into his hat for later. And one of those notes has been known as the fragment on slavery. There's no evidence that he actually used this in a speech or in a letter. It's possible. But there's no specific evidence that he ever did use it. But what it does is it really turns the issue of slavery upside down and on its head. So he argues that people with darker skin are to be enslaved by people with lighter skin. So he asks the question about what happens when a man with lighter skin comes upon you? Does he turn you into a slave? And he brings the same issue up with intellect. You argue that slaves are less intelligent than white men. Okay, well, what about when you come across a man who's smarter than you? Does he get to turn you into a slave? So he's really using logic and wit to argue that slavery is wrong. Again, we don't know that he ever used this particular piece of writing, but we do know that he was obviously thinking about the issue and trying to think of different ways to communicate his point of view on the topic. So moving forward, we've got a speech in 1854. It's a speech in Peoria rebutting Stephen A. Douglas. By this point, Abraham Lincoln's House term had ended. He's been out of office for a period of time. This is his comeback speech. And in his comeback speech, he's starting to be a little more aggressive and vocal in his concerns about slavery. So he's frustrated by the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. And he argues, he says, for the spread of slavery, I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its good influence in the world, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty. So very powerful words, especially considering what he had been saying previously. He argues that sanctioning slavery goes against the very founding principles of the country. But at the same time, he acknowledges that slaveholders in the 1850s, they didn't start slavery, that this is an ongoing condition. It's been going on for years, hundreds of years by this point. And he acknowledges that the people who are benefiting from slavery today are not the ones who created the situation. So he's still trying to approach the issue in a balanced sort of way, even as he's starting to push the idea that it's a horrible injustice. So he really notes the difficulty of eliminating slavery and the fact that he doesn't know how the country should eliminate slavery. And it's refreshing when you read Abraham Lincoln that he was the first guy to say he doesn't have all the answers. That's not easy for many of us to acknowledge, and Abraham Lincoln was good at saying that. He talked about repatriating slaves back to Africa, but he also acknowledged the logistical challenges thereof. He was not the first to do that. I've enjoyed reading some of Thomas Jefferson's early work where he talked about colonization back to Africa and tried to do the math to figure out how that would work. And in doing the math, he realized it would be very difficult to be able to repatriate all of the African Americans who were in the United States at that time, to bring them all back to Africa. And of course, the problem for those people is the fact that Africa is a continent, not a particular location. They didn't speak the language. None of them had lived there before. So moving them to Africa was not necessarily in the best interest of these slaves either. So he did acknowledge that it would be hard for him to accept former slaves as equals, and that he was fearful that they wouldn't be accepted by white society in general. So he's really looking at the full picture and realizing the significant challenges in ending slavery, no matter which approach is used in order to do so. So he does acknowledge in this statement that slaveholders have a constitutional right to own property, and that slaves are property, and truly it is in the Constitution. And as much as Abraham Lincoln had strong views about slavery, he had even stronger views about following the Constitution. So he felt as though slaves should be returned to their masters because they were rightful property, and due process confirms ownership. So he felt as though he could not, in good conscience, advocate anything else. He felt that slavery should not be extended, and he expressed his concerns about repealing the Missouri Compromise. He looked at the 3/5 clause and spoke about how that skewed the political landscape and the will of the people. And even though he had these concerns, he said he would abide by the laws because those were the laws of the land. So again, he's not looking to eliminate slavery through radical action. And actually, he in his lifetime was very critical of radical abolitionists. He wanted to work within the system to make the changes that would result in ending slavery and resolving that challenge for the entire nation. So 1855, he writes to his very good friend Joshua Speed. He writes again that he opposes the extension of slavery. So he talks about the riverboat trip they had taken in 1841 and how he was tormented about the idea of slavery ever since that point. He wants to put the Missouri Compromise back in effect, and he felt that, and again, Joshua Speed is a Southerner, so he wanted his Southern friend to know that Northerners crucify their feelings in order to maintain their loyalty to the Constitution. So in this case, he's stressing the fact that while Southerners feel as though they have been persecuted to a degree about the issue of slavery, and they feel the burden of having to defend the practice, he argues that Northerners have some struggles about this too, and yet they stay loyal to the Constitution. 1858 in Chicago, just a couple days ago, many years ago, he talks again about hating slavery. He talks about being a Whig, but again, having hated it. He notes, though, that just like the country, he's starting to become a little bit more vociferous in his concerns about slavery. Slavery is coming to a head in the country as a whole, and Abraham Lincoln is right there with many other people starting to push for a solution to this issue. Again, by this point, North and South are very aggressively on opposite sides, and Abraham Lincoln is expressing that in his comments here. So he does again say that slaveholders have the right under the Constitution, and he talks about individuals in free states. should not meddle in the affairs of slaveholding states. So he's advocating for the states' rights argument. But by the same token, he feels as though it should be ultimately extinct. A couple months later, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Charleston, Illinois. He pushes for emancipation in this, but he still continues to stress that blacks and whites were not equal. So he's not advocating for equality as much as he's advocating for eliminating the practice of slavery. He is not pushing for political, judicial, or social equality. And he goes on to state that one race would have to be superior. And of course, because one race would be superior to the other, he feels as though the white race should be the race that takes the upper hand. So this brings me to a little side note about Abraham Lincoln. Historians have, for basically since his death, argued about whether he was a racist, a white supremacist, an abolitionist, what exactly his take was on race relations. And again, it's hard to tell. I've been reading the works of several historians recently who are arguing, including David Blight. He's been arguing that Abraham Lincoln's views really don't come out in some of the language that I'm quoting here. Instead, what Abraham Lincoln is really doing is he's saying things that he thinks that society in general is ready to hear, and that over time he is starting to feed the public more controversial statements as the public begins to move towards this culmination in this Civil War. So because all we have are public statements, it's hard to tell. Just like our politicians today, sometimes politicians then might have said things that said things for effect. You know, it doesn't mean that somebody does or doesn't believe it, but it might be said for effect. And of course, Abraham Lincoln, if he truly felt as though blacks and whites should be equal and got up and said that, he would probably not have an opportunity to say much more, because the vast majority of white Americans at that time did feel as though blacks and whites were not equal. So had he gone too far, he would have lost his ability to continue to sway public opinion. So again, it's hard to know exactly where he stood. We only have his statements, but in looking at these, you can see not only how his mind is starting to shift, or potentially how his mind is starting to shift, you can also see how the country is starting to shift. You can see that this issue is coming up more and more frequently and being discussed more and more aggressively. Another of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, this one October 7th in Galesburg, Lincoln says that the Declaration pertained to everyone, including Negroes. And you know, that's kind of a revolutionary statement at the time, that all men meant all men. That wasn't the pervasive view in the period. He also talks about how he struggles with slavery as a moral, social, and political evil, and really is again trying to look for a way to eliminate slavery without eliminate slavery peacefully. So a couple days later, the next Lincoln-Douglas debate in Quincy, once again, he's talking about that issue. He extends his arguments about the founding fathers, that they were against slavery, and he uses the fact that the Atlantic slave trade was ended in 1808 as his evidence. The fact that they abolished the slave trade in the Constitution, he says, is evidence that the founding fathers were not really in support of slavery. So he does say that the founders really didn't have a good solution to eliminate slavery, and they expected it to become extinct. And that is definitely true. The founding fathers knew that if they made slavery an issue in the Constitution and in that period where they were framing the Constitution, they knew that they would lose the southern states, and we would not end up with we wouldn't end up with a constitution at all, and we might not end up with 13 states all working for common good. So he knew that, or the founding fathers knew that they had to kind of kick slavery down the road, and they hoped, again, what would happen to slavery in the United States would be similar to what happened in many other places, and that would be that it just stopped being financially viable and it would just kind of die out. Most of us, or many of us, a few years ago, we had a DVD player, and now it's difficult to buy DVDs, and many of us are eliminating our DVDs. That's a trite example, but that's kind of the mindset that the founders had, is that, eventually this will just be obsolete. We will just move on to use some other system of labor because this won't work. Abraham Lincoln also, in his words, he liked to argue that people work harder when they're being paid than they do when they're being forced. So he really did view slavery in an economic lens. So a couple days later, 1858, so again, we're starting to see many more comments by Abraham Lincoln by 1858 on the topic of slavery. So he writes in this particular letter that it does not follow that social and political equality between whites and blacks must be incorporated, because slavery must not. So he's saying, again, that whites and blacks don't have to be equal, but that slavery should be eliminated. So he's reiterating this point over and over again. 1859, he goes a little bit further. I suppose it may long exist, and perhaps the best way for it to come to an end peaceably is for it to exist for a length of time. But I say that the spread and strengthening and perpetuation of it is an entirely different proposition. There we should in every way resist it as a wrong, treating it as a wrong, with the fixed idea that it must and will come to an end. So again, Abraham Lincoln's view on slavery, and this is what he is saying in the 1860 election as well. He is saying that he's not advocating for eliminating slavery where it exists. He's advocating for preventing the spread of slavery, with the idea that eventually, gradually, emancipation will come and slaves will be freed. So that's the tack that he is promoting, which is certainly a more gentle way to end slavery than what ends up happening as a result of Abraham Lincoln's pen. 1861 is first inaugural. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so and no inclination to do so. So Abraham Lincoln is, in this statement, he's trying to bring the nation together on this idea of slavery. He's trying to calm those states in the South with the idea that, look, I am not trying to eliminate this practice where it exists, but I do want to make sure that it doesn't spread. Again, if you were a slaveholder in the South, the idea that slavery would not spread was terrifying to you, because slavery would not be profitable if it could not spread. American slaves were having babies and slave populations were growing, and the only way to maintain the value of your property is to be able to see slavery spread into new places. So we have the original 13 colonies that are still slaveholding are not, they're not as heavily invested in slavery as they had been, and we're seeing slavery start to move across the country. Mississippi and Alabama and states like that are the states that are really benefiting more from slavery at this point, and they know that they have to be able to continue to move it across the country in order for it to be economically viable. And that is the thing that Abraham Lincoln is advocating against. So he does also reiterate that he supports the fugitive slave laws, that even though he personally is not in favor of the fugitive slave law, that it is essential that people have their property returned to them, and that all citizens are subject to laws despite what they believe personally. So no matter what you think is true or not true, that it's important to make sure that laws are followed, and that to make a change, the law needs to be changed. So he addresses Congress in March of 1862. By this point, we are well into the Civil War, almost a year in. He encourages Congress to make incentives to states who are willing to consider gradual emancipation. He acknowledges that this is Congress's decision, but he feels as though gradual emancipation with compensation is the way to go. And he feels this way all the way up until just a few months before he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. He felt as though that was a way to preserve the Union. And he really wants to focus on the border states, to allow those border states to eliminate or to gradually emancipate their slaves with compensation. The idea that, again, if this is an economic issue, giving slave owners compensation for the loss of property is a fair way to approach the issue. He felt that if border states would sign on to emancipation, even gradual emancipation, that would help prevent the border states from even considering joining the Confederacy. So he, for several reasons, felt as though this idea of gradual emancipation was the most effective way to go about this. He goes further. By July 12th of 1862, he makes an appeal to the border states, again, reminding the states that he made an address to Congress in March, offering gradual compensated emancipation. And he really had thought, as everyone did, that the Civil War was not going to last very long. He thought it would have been over by that point. And he felt as though if the border states would just sign on to to gradual emancipation, that would really potentially result in the war ending much more quickly or almost immediately. So he had very strong ideas about why this gradual emancipation needed to be pursued. As we all know, obviously that didn't end up being something that the border states ended up taking advantage of. So Abraham Lincoln starts to move on with his next strategy. So even as he's contemplating the Emancipation Proclamation, he's still handing out an olive branch to the border states to encourage gradual compensated emancipation. So he first talks to his cabinet members on July 13th, 1862, talks about emancipating slaves just in the rebel territories. He felt as though it was an absolute necessity to preserve the Union. And there's a couple reasons why. First of all, the Union forces had been completely ineffective in the war up until this point, that he could not emancipate the border states. And the other big issue that he was noticing is that the slaves in the South were being used to help the Southern armies, the Confederacy, fight in the war. It is certainly much easier to fight a war when you have extra manpower to help you build fortifications and breastworks and all of the things necessary for war. And the slaves were engaged in doing that. So it did give the Confederacy a potentially an unfair advantage. And that was another consideration for Lincoln. He did think that he needed to emancipate rebel areas first. And his thought was if he could emancipate those rebel areas, that emancipation would spread from there and eventually it would take hold across the country. So he has a cabinet meeting July 21st and 22nd. In that period, there's a cabinet meeting where he presents several drafts of a new order. He wants to use blacks as laborers in the army, and that was, of course, a revolutionary idea to use African Americans to help support the Union war effort. He wants Union officers to keep records of confiscated property, including slaves, to compensate loyal owners. And he also promotes, once again, this idea of colonization to an unspecified tropical climate, maybe in the Caribbean, maybe in Africa, someplace else. So those are the ideas that he puts forward. The next day, on the 22nd, he comes back with a slightly modified set of statements. So he argues that the Confederates should lose their property unless they cease the rebellion within 60 days. He continued to support gradual and compensated emancipation, and he called for the immediate emancipation of slaves in the areas in rebellion as of January 1st, 1863. He he said that the slaves in the Confederacy were not to be emancipated in that conversation. So those are the things he's promoting in July. He continues to think about this, continues to work it through, and ends up with a slightly modified version of that. We'll get to that in a moment. I want to talk for a bit about why he's decided to approach emancipation in Confederate states and doing this by military order rather than legislation. There are a lot of reasons, and this is, in my opinion, as a historian and a scholar, I find this to be probably the single most interesting document in American history, because it does so many things at the same time. Even though you could argue that in some ways it does almost nothing. It is again, fascinating. So what he does is he knows that it's unpopular to eliminate slavery across the country. So eliminating slavery in the border states, eliminating slavery everywhere would be very difficult for people, even in the North, to accept. Many of them would not be happy with this. So obviously the Confederacy, they have been disloyal, they are traitorous to the Union. So as a result, he has this opportunity to sort of punish them. So despite that, he's really essentially, you could argue that he's overstepping his constitutional powers. And he didn't have a lot of support in the period. It's funny to think today, you know, Abraham Lincoln, we revere him. He is known as one of our best presidents, but at the time, he was getting flack from the abolitionists, he was getting flack from the unionists, he was getting flack from pretty much everybody. He didn't have a lot of, he didn't really have much of a mandate to work with. So because of this, he's got to be very delicate in how he approaches this issue. So emancipation gave him a couple really important things. This Emancipation Declaration allowed him to essentially block the Confederacy from gaining support from England and France. England and France were very much positioned to jump in and help the Confederacy. There were actually troops in Canada, English troops, who were prepared to come in and help the Confederacy fight the war. And it's hard for us sometimes in history to remember how precarious particular events were, because we know how it turned out. It's a lot like watching the Super Bowl the Monday after it's played. We know what happened. We're not on the edge of our seats. But there was a time where it looked like France and England were going to jump in with the Confederacy, and that made sense, in great part because the Confederacy produced cotton. One of the biggest years of cotton production ever in the history of our country was 1860. And the South was incredibly wealthy as a result of their cotton production. England and France needed that cotton in order to produce finished goods. They were all into textiles, and the raw materials that they needed to create those textiles came from the South. So England and France had an economic interest in supporting the Confederacy. There were certainly also some political arguments to be made as well. So by reframing the fight over slavery and changing it from it being a bit of a power play to it being about slavery specifically, changed the tenor of the war and really put England and France in a place where it would be very difficult for them to support the Confederacy. You know, how do you fight a war in favor of a country maintaining slavery? You've lost the moral high ground. So England and France ended up not supporting the Confederacy in the war, in part because of the Emancipation Proclamation and the change that it made to, again, reframe the war as being about slavery. Now, that change was not popular everywhere. There were definitely Union soldiers and people in the North who were not happy that suddenly they are fighting to eliminate slavery because they were not in favor of doing so. So this move was not popular in the North and unpopular in the South. There were definitely people in the North who were equally concerned about this idea. So why wouldn't he pass a law? Why did Abraham Lincoln not just opt for having Congress write a law that would go into effect? There are a couple different reasons. Obviously, Congress is the one that passes a law, and even though the Congress would have almost definitely passed something that allowed for emancipation, it would have taken time. As we know today, having anything passed through Congress can take a very long time. And you don't always get out of Congress what you hope to get out of Congress. So Lincoln was very concerned that whatever passed wouldn't be anything that he wanted or thought would be useful. He also wanted to time this so that the Emancipation Proclamation, or at least the initial version, was announced after a Union victory. And he had to wait a while to get a Union victory, but eventually, after the Battle of Antietam, he thought that was close enough to a Union victory to be able to issue this document. So he wanted to issue this from a position of strength versus a position of weakness. The Union forces had not been doing well in the war, in the early couple years of the war. And again, having this document released at a time when the Union was not winning would have come off as weak and sort of desperate. So he needed to come from a position of power. And there's no guarantee that Congress would have delivered this bill at just the moment when the Union forces were finally victorious. He was also concerned about judicial review. Certainly we know that the Taney Court did not favor emancipation, just given the Dred Scott decision, the Merryman decision. So he knew that it was risky to go through the legislature. You go through the legislature, then the Supreme Court gets involved, and potentially something can be ruled unconstitutional. So Taney had already argued that slavery was a state's issue, and that states got to decide whether they continued or eliminated slavery based on the wishes of that particular state. He also promoted the idea that no one could be deprived of their property, even if it was human property. So Lincoln was probably he was probably using his head when he realized that it was quite likely that even if Congress passed a bill that he liked, that it would be overturned by the Supreme Court eventually. And so as a result, he decided to approach this differently. He decided to approach this as a military action. He argued that this is a military necessity to end the war. And in many ways, again, it was. It certainly sent a psychological blow to the South. It eliminated once slaves started to hear about this, even in areas that were not covered by the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves began to leave. So the Confederate plantations and other places where they utilized slaves, they started to see their labor force diminish, particularly problematic at a time when men are off fighting in the war themselves. So there's an economic impact there to the South. There's the psychological impact to the South. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we're now taking away the labor force that's helping the Confederacy fight the war. So he argues that the Confederate States are in rebellion, so they're no longer under the jurisdiction of the United States. That allows him to get around the Constitution and to get around this idea that the states make the decisions about slavery, and that slavery, again, is protected in the Constitution. So he's able to get around this by arguing that it's part of his war powers as a commander-in-chief. So he thinks that this, again, is going to end the insurrection, and that at the same time the slaves will end up being freed. He looks just at the areas in rebellion. And if you read the actual Emancipation Proclamation, parts of it are incredibly detailed about exactly where slavery is allowed to continue and where it isn't. If the Union troops were occupying a particular area in the Confederacy, those areas were not eligible for emancipation. New Orleans, for example, the slaves in New Orleans, because that was occupied, they were not eligible for emancipation, even though slaves in other parts of Louisiana were. So he was very, very specific about where he felt he had the power to eliminate slavery and where he didn't. This was important because it allowed him to not strain his credibility, so to speak, with the North and with other places that were not in rebellion. He was always concerned about losing the border states. He said many times that if I lose Kentucky, I will lose the whole war. So he wanted to make sure that those border states stay loyal to the Union, and therefore he didn't tamper with their with slavery for those areas. He just focused on the places where slaves, or where the Confederacy had taken hold, and where those areas were in rebellion. So January 1st, 1863, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And a great story about that proclamation is that in the morning of 1863, Abraham Lincoln and his wife Mary host an annual open house. The White House used to be the people's house, and people could come anytime and visit the White House. And on that particular morning, they had a reception, and Abraham Lincoln spent several hours shaking hands with visitors to the White House, and eventually, a couple hours later, excused himself to come up and sign the Emancipation Proclamation. As this story goes, he picks up the pen, dips the steel quill in the ink, and gets ready to sign, and puts the pen down. And of course, everyone in the room thinks, oh my goodness, is he not going to sign this? What's going to happen? So Abraham Lincoln says, no, that's not what's going on. His hand was shaking because he had been shaking hands for so long, and he was very concerned. He said that this was such a momentous event to sign this document that he needed to be able to sign it without his hand shaking. If his hand shook as he signed, if his signature was at all wavering, it would appear as though he was not determined in his decision to sign this document. So he shook his hand out, gave it a little rest, and then picked up the pen, signed the document, and said, basically, that will do, in his humble way of being. From there, he goes on record saying, I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it. Abraham Lincoln has a very good grasp of what people are willing to tolerate, what the public is prepared to accept. And he was very good at leading people without forcing their opinions. And again, focusing on the places where the rebellion was active was a way that he was able to do that. So he was obviously correct in his idea that signing this document was the thing that was going to have him known forever. Arguably, this is considered one of the most important documents in American history. Here's a couple words from the Emancipation Proclamation. And even as you're looking at this, let me just say there have been historians, including Richard Hofstadter, who have argued that the Emancipation Proclamation was a bill of lading, like kind of a shipping document. It was not well written. It was not a soaring rhetoric like many of Lincoln's other works. The reason why is because this was a legal document, and Lincoln wanted to deliver it as such, as opposed to making it more of a position statement. So he focused on it being very cut and dried in that way. There are historians who still argue that, gosh, if you're going to do something this big, you need to make it a little more juicy, a little more emotional. But obviously that is not the way that Lincoln went about doing this. It is very dry. It's hard to read because there's not a lot to hold on to. But it's certainly in its brevity, it does exactly what it is that Lincoln wanted to see done. So again, he's selling this as a war measure for suppressing the rebellion. That's his focus. This is about eliminating rebellion. This is not, he doesn't sell it as freeing the slaves, he sells it as suppressing the rebellion by freeing the slaves. So he makes the freeing the slaves kind of an outcome of the action of suppressing the rebellion. And that's consistent with his public statements throughout his life. He always focused on keeping the Union. He felt as though that was his job as the President of the United States, was to maintain the Union. So this was what he felt he needed to do in order to maintain the Union. That's not to say that he wasn't in favor of emancipation, but again, his leading motivation was about eliminating the rebellion. And at the same time, he knew that this was a very good thing because it would also eliminate slavery. So he does a couple interesting things in this document. He does ask that the people that he's freeing, these African-American slaves, he asks them to abstain from all violence. And this is interesting. So there's an expectation that when the slaves are free, they're going to riot. And Abraham Lincoln doesn't exactly expect that to happen, but he does ask them to refrain from violence. However, he gives them some wiggle room. He says, unless it's necessary in self-defense. So he's giving them an opportunity to defend themselves, but by the same token saying, please don't just be indiscriminate in violence. In addition to that, he does the same thing with labor. He recommends that these people labor faithfully. So he is arguing that these freed African Americans should work hard, but he also says that they should work hard for reasonable wages. So he expects that they will be paid a reasonable wage. And notice he doesn't say what that wage is. So he's actually giving these African Americans the ability to determine what is a reasonable wage. So he's providing them with both some recommendations, and he's making the white population feel a little safer by discouraging violence and by encouraging hard work. But at the same time, he's giving freed slaves some tools in order to protect themselves and make sure that they're being treated fairly. Furthermore, he encourages that freed slaves, and these of course are men, not women, but freed slaves in suitable condition can serve in the armed services in the Union Army. So that's a big deal because of course that was not really considered previously. And if we go further in American history, it is quite a long time until African Americans are welcomed into all roles in the military, into World War II actually. So the fact that he's welcoming these slaves freed slaves into the Union Army is important. Now, of course, welcoming the slaves does a couple different things. First of all, they're short of manpower. African Americans, there were about 200,000, about 190,000 African Americans who served in the Union Army. So that's a significant chunk of people who are ready to fight for the Union cause. So he gains the ability to recruit a whole new group of people. And again, he's promoting this idea of how African Americans should be treated in the post-slavery era. So what did it do? It did a couple things. The Union Army is now an army of liberation. So they're not just fighting this civil war and putting down the rebellion against the Confederacy. They're also an army of liberation. So when they go into a new territory, if they conquer the Confederacy and they take possession of a new bit of land, they're now liberating the slaves that are there in that area. So there were definitely some military personnel who were not comfortable with that as their function, but the reality was the commander-in-chief said, so now that was what was happening. African Americans started to hear about this, and even before the Union armies liberated certain areas, slaves started leaving. And so of course, as slaves start moving into the Union controlled areas, there are some challenges. We won't get into too much of that just because the challenge of talking about anything Abraham Lincoln is, it gets very big. So I'm trying to keep our scope down. But there were definitely challenges in contraband camps as they had previously been known. In these camps where African Americans came, You know, where do they go? What do we do? How does this work? But because the idea of freedom had traveled so quickly, many of the slaves knew before their masters even knew about this Emancipation Proclamation. And if you were a slave, it didn't really matter to you whether the place where you lived was in rebellion or not. The idea of freedom was so appealing that many started to flee. And the more slaves that fled, it just perpetuated more slaves fleeing. And eventually, the vast majority of them started to leave. Furthermore, this committed the US government to a policy of emancipation. It started to frame the war as a war of freedom, which impacted foreign governments. So the United States is now on the road to emancipation and really is going to have a difficult time getting off that path. We see Abraham Lincoln continue to push this in the 13th Amendment because he realizes that the Emancipation Proclamation is a war document, and when the war is over, what happens next? So he starts pushing the 13th Amendment. If you've seen the Steven Spielberg movie Lincoln, it does a nice, although dramatized job kind of illustrating that period of time and how Abraham Lincoln fought to have that amendment added to the Constitution, knowing that if slavery's eradication was in the Constitution, it was going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for that work to be undone. Whereas a military order in the middle of war, as soon as the war is over, could result in slavery returning to areas of the country. Again, he's authorizing recruitment of African Americans to the Army or to the military, and he transformed the war into a war of conquest. So previously, the goal of the Union was just to put down the rebellion and for everybody to come back and get along nicely again. And the war changed, and in the North and the South, they knew that war had changed, and now the goal of the war was unconditional surrender. It was no longer about finding a collaborative end. It was about total surrender. So he reframed the entire war by issuing this particular document. All right, what questions do you have? Does anyone have any questions? Oh, way back about 1,000 hours ago, someone asked the definition of colonization. So let me explain what colonization is. Colonization is essentially just what we know it to be in this country, which is people coming from one place and setting up a new system of government and social structures and all of that in another place. So the idea was that African Americans would be taken from the United States, either voluntarily, and there were periods of time where they actually did voluntary colonization. The capital, well, Liberia is the country that the United States sent people to, Liberia, Liberty, you can kind of see how that's in there. It is actually the only country capital that is named after an American president. It's named after James Monroe. So they sent about 50,000 African Americans to Liberia. What ended up happening to them is tragic. They didn't end up faring very well. I mean, first of all, they'd never been there before. If you study colonial history and saw what happened to our early colonists in the United States, in Jamestown and other places like that. Essentially, it was a similar sort of situation for African Americans who went back to Africa. They had never lived there. Their parents had never lived there. Their grandparents had never lived there. They had no idea what they were going to. And as a result, many of them died very quickly. And African Americans did not want to go. So then this issue of colonization became, do we force people? Now we force people to leave Africa, do we put them on a ship and force them to go back? So this idea of colonization started very early on. Many of the founding fathers were very much in favor of colonization on both sides of the slavery debate. So it was a very commonly known sort of idea. And the belief was that blacks and whites cannot live together in this country, and therefore we need to send them back where they came from, and just separate the races. You know, it's interesting, given if you look at American history from the Civil War forward, how many struggles we've had with race. I'm not at all advocating colonization, but it's interesting in that colonization argument, you can see that people were aware well before slavery ended that this was going to be complicated. We weren't going to go to bed on December 31st, 1862, before the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, and wake up the next morning and have everything be nice and smooth. You know, we've struggled with how to end slavery and how to address the wrongs of slavery ever since then. So that was one of the strategies proposed, and it was a very popular one, was to simply just send people back where they came from. How we were going to do that, of course, there was a huge cost involved in that. And, you know, as people continue to have babies, how do you ever keep up with, you know, with boats? How do you ever send enough people away that the net numbers end up dropping? So obviously never happened, but that's the concept of colonization. Does anyone else have a question?
No questions?
So either it went really well or everybody is sleeping. And it's hard to tell on Zoom which one is true.
Well, I saw a few hands. Oh, here's a question. How was
Okay.
emancipation received by the white public? This is from Rochelle Gridley.
Thank you for that question. Yes, and thank you, because gosh, I feel a little lame if no one asks me a question. So even if it's a pity question, I appreciate it. So that's a really great question, Rochelle, and it's tricky because you can't say how all white people felt in one sentence, because there were many different views. The abolitionists were thrilled. Many of them were really pleased by this. Of course, some of them felt like Abraham Lincoln didn't go far enough. So, you know, the poor guy, he caught flack no matter what he did. It was too much. It was not enough. So some people felt like it was too much to emancipate these slaves. Others, again, felt like he should have emancipated all slaves, not just the ones that technically he had no control over because they were in states that had left our union. So there were some who felt like it was an empty sort of a gesture. There were some who were very offended. If you were in the South, you were furious and potentially stood to lose a lot of money. The value of the slaves in that period, it was immense. The different historians, I've heard a few different numbers bandied about, but numbers in the billions, $3 billion, $4 billion. The value of slaves in that period was extreme. If you were a slave trader in 1860, you could make as much as $150,000 in a week trading slave. I mean, it was incredibly lucrative. So if you were in the South and you owned 500 slaves, and let's be conservative and say they're all worth $500. You know, if you do that math, if you all that is an asset, and then suddenly it's gone. So yes. So it depended on who you were. There were a lot of different opinions about it. Some people were happy, some people were angry. So it looks like Jen Sinclair Johnson has a question. Not a pity question. Thank you. I appreciate that. And that's okay if you're slow, because you typed a lot of words. That's a lot of words to type. So I mentioned a book by, David, arguing that Abraham Lincoln's views don't come out in language. Oh, okay. You know what? There's actually quite a few different books that make that argument. One of them is a book that I'm sure you've heard of, Team of Rivals, by Doris Kearns Goodwin. I think the person you might be referring to is Richard Hofstadter. He's written quite a few, Alan Gelzo is another well-known historian who's written quite a bit about Abraham Lincoln. Oh, and the David that you mentioned is probably David Blight. I'm going to share something with you now. This is kind of exciting. So if you've ever been on YouTube, and if you haven't, maybe today's the day. If you just search David Blight, Blight, he's got, he teaches history at Yale University, and he has got an entire series of classes. His entire Civil War history class is on YouTube. You can watch the entire, yes, someone's here. You can watch the entire thing on YouTube. You can watch every single episode. You can also listen to it as a podcast if you prefer to do it that way. It's on iTunes University as well. So there are a couple different ways to access this. He does a wonderful job of really bringing each element of the Civil War together. And he was the one that I was mentioning earlier. Other questions? Oh,
I got a question via text message.
Oh, okay then. That's a sneaky way to do it.
It's from Tori, and she asks, if news spreads so quickly in some areas of the South, can you talk about why it took 2.5 years for news of the Emancipation Proclamation to reach Galveston, Texas, a day which is celebrated as Juneteenth today?
I can do that. And I debated about putting that in, but again, the challenge with Abraham Lincoln is minimizing the scope. So that's a great question. The reason why is because the Civil War never really got into Texas at all. Texas was essentially isolated in that way, and slaves were not generally, it was discouraged by law and practice to teach slaves to read or write. So slaves would not have access to information through the news, and because they were so isolated, the slaves who did know about freedom, they weren't going further south. They weren't going to Texas. They were mostly going to the north or looking for their own families. But Texas, again, was far enough away that they ended up being isolated, and they didn't know until 2 years later when they were finally told. Technically, they had been freed in the Emancipation Proclamation, but just like anything else, if you don't know it, then you can't act on it. And that is why the slaves in Texas celebrate Juneteenth as opposed to the Emancipation Day, which was January 1st, 1863. Juneteenth has been a celebration ever since then in some parts of the country, and I know in the last year, just given all of the things that have gone on in our country recently, it's become a holiday that more people are aware of. Other questions?
Excellent.
Oh,
we got one in the chat box. This is from
okay.
Cammie. Lincoln's dilemma in figuring out what to do with emancipated slaves is put into perspective by a June 1862 vote in Springfield reinstating the Illinois Black Laws, which prohibited African Americans from immigrating into Illinois. The vote was 1929 to 133 in favor of continuing Black laws. So I'm not sure what the question
I think Cammie is, I don't think that's a question as much as she's pointing this out. And it's a really good point. So, we in Illinois, sometimes we like to kind of puff our chests because we were not part of, we didn't have slaves. So it makes us, better, but we certainly had laws that restricted the rights of African Americans. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we had apprenticeship programs, which were essentially just slavery under a different name. So we could kind of get around the fact that we're not a slaveholding state because of the Missouri Compromise. So you're absolutely right. Lincoln's dilemma in figuring out what to do, it comes from there. What do we do when we eliminate slavery? We've got in Illinois, where we don't have slavery, the vast majority are voting to continue Black laws. So, and Black laws, for those of you who aren't familiar, Black laws are laws that target African Americans specifically. There are many more Black laws that are passed in Reconstruction, and there are all mostly in the South, but there are all sorts of laws that say things like, if you're a Black person and you're unemployed, then we can arrest you, and then we can put you to work as a lend-lease prisoner. If you're a Black person, you can't congregate in groups of more than 2 people unless you have permission. If you're a Black person, you can't own a knife or a gun, things like that. So Black laws were very, they were obviously race-based and very limiting to African Americans. There were laws like that that were on the books even before the Civil War. So again, I think what Cammie, I think it's Cammie, yes, what Cammie is arguing is that, racism did not just exist in the South. And this issue of like, how do we just all get along and figure this out and live happily ever after? How do we do happily ever after when people have believed this all to be true? I mean, there's an enormous record. You can go to Google Books and other places like that. Google Books in particular is great because you can look at actual books that were published 100, 200 years ago that are out of copyright. And you can read the whole darn thing on Google Books and even search within the books. There are many books that are the pro-slavery narratives. And people promoted this idea that slavery was necessary for a couple reasons. They cherry-picked language from the Bible. That was one argument, that God wanted slavery to happen, and therefore we're just following God's word. There was an argument that it was actually better to enslave African Americans because they didn't necessarily know how to do it right themselves. Without us, they would starve to death, kind of an argument. So that was one argument that was made. And then the third argument was about intelligence. And this was the time when phrenology, the study of the skull and the shape of your head and how big is your head is how big is your brain and all that kind of stuff comes up. So these arguments that African Americans are less intelligent are pervasive. People, like many people, believe that African Americans are less intelligent than Caucasians. That's just a thing that many people believe. So, I think, again, what Cammie's point is, how do we move beyond that? So we've got another, oh, it's Candace. Are there, I was like, oh, we have another question, but it's just you again.
Just me.
Fine, I'm a little disappointed. Are there any other questions? I can talk all day. You probably figured that out already.
Well, it doesn't look like it.
Looks
And
like
so,
we've answered.
yeah. So once again, thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us this afternoon and sharing this fast. Oh, wait, one more program. Oh, no, just a good presentation. Excellent.
Thank you, Sally. I love that there are so many women on this. I thought it would be all men because Civil War history tends to be a man thing. And I love it that, go ladies. I also teach women's history, so we can get together and talk about that sometime.
Fantastic. Well, we're thrilled to be able to have had this program on today, this weekend, what would have been Lincoln's Festival on Route 66, a hot one just like last year. So we were very happy to be able to still have your program, even though we're all at home in the air conditioning. And I do want to remind people that if you enjoyed today's presentation and would like to donate or become a member, I did drop that into the chat box. And if you're interested in our next program, which kind of links to your program, where we will have Susan Lindsay on August 1st, who will be talking about her book, Liberty Brought Us Here, The True Story of American Slaves Who Migrated to Liberia. I also put the link in the chat box that you can sign up for that Zoom webinar on August 1st at 1:30 in the afternoon. Otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you again, Sarah, and have a good afternoon and stay cool wherever you are.
Thank you very much. Can I put in one quick plug?
Yes.
If you are interested in women's history, I do teach a women's history class at McHenry County College. In district, out of district is the same price. It is an online class. I'm teaching it in the fall and the spring. So if you're interested in women's history, that might be a great way to get some great facts about women and their role in American history. So I'd love to see you there. I really appreciate all of your attention and your great comments and questions. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak. Thank you, Candace, for having me.
Thank you again.